A significant part of the Kutsche Office of Local History is to make more fully known our multi-ethnic and multiracial, even multinational past, and the meaning of that past for us today. When we decided on an environmental or agricultural focus for this year's panel, I knew it would be especially important to discuss two key aspects of our Indigenous pasts, presents, and futures in relationship to our theme. These two aspects are, one, how settler colonialism affected our environment and continues to do so, and two, how the assumptions about the assumption of a solely extractive relationship with other living things as somehow natural or the only kind of relationship with other living things has so profoundly limited our view of historical progress as it's known. I hope that this panel will help us to think about other kinds of relations with the natural world in the past and in the future. Each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes. We are waiting for one of our other panelists still, so hopefully he'll be joining us. And then we will have time for both questions from myself and from the audience, and if you want to question each other, that's an option as well. When we get to the questions, I just want to remind you to please use a microphone to ask your question, and I do have another one that I can come out into the audience with as well. This ensures that the widest possible range of people in the audience can hear your question. And I know it's natural to think, I can talk to a large group, I can project, I'm one of those people, but I want to say for accessibility purposes, it's really better to use the microphone, and this also ensures that the video recording of this, the people can hear the questions on the video recording for people who couldn't make it here today. So please, if you could do that, that would be great. And now I want to go ahead and introduce the panelists. And for more information about them, you can also check our program. I'm going to introduce everybody once, and then I'll have you, talk in sequence, and you can talk from over there or over here. It's up to you. Our first panelist today will be Dr. Andrea Riley-Mukavetz, who currently works as the Community Engagement Manager for the City of Grand Rapids. She published her first book, You Better Go See Jerry, an Odawa Elder's Life of Recovery and Resilience, in 2021. Today, Andrea will share her ongoing research on the Anishinaabeg Trails of Michigan and the impact settler colonialism has had on the environment, landscape, and cultural traditions of the Anishinaabeg. She will also address how the Anishinaabeg have engaged in land-based practices that adapted from the impact of settler colonialism. Then we will have Kaya DeerInWater to present from the Citizen Band of Potawatomi. And he lives currently in Wasatanack, Grand Rapids, Michigan, otherwise known as, with his family. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Davis in ecological restoration and management, and he's currently pursuing a master's degree in biocultural restoration at SUNY ESF in Syracuse, New York. Kaya has previously served as a research assistant on a large-scale riparian ecological restoration project and team lead on a post-fire ecological monitoring project with the U.S. Forest Service, as well as a community garden manager for the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, intertribal food systems coordinator for the Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin, and the Great Lakes Intertribal Food Coalition, and various other contract positions supporting Indigenous lifeways, especially regarding seed keeping and plant knowledge. And he really strives to support Native communities in developing relationships with plants and land through recognition with plant-based Indigenous knowledge of culturally significant plants. And lastly, Camren Stott should be joining us, who is from the Little Traverse Bay of Odawa Indians and currently works as Good Food Systems Program Manager for Access of West Michigan. He's also a chef who is dedicated to re-indigenizing food systems from the ground up and is a GVSU student, which makes us especially happy to have him share his knowledge with us, hopefully in a little bit here today. So now I want to go ahead and turn it over to our first panelist, Andrea. Thank you.
Ani, Andrea, Riley-Mukavetz, Indigenous, Dashkinzi being Anishinaabeg, Kajijak Nidodum, Waya Tanang, Nojaba. My name's Andrea. I'm a citizen of the Chippewa of Thames First Nation Band. I'm Crane Clan. I'm from the Metro Detroit area, and I'm happy to be here with you today. Before I begin, I wanted to say thank you to my teachers, family, and community who have guided me through my research. Helen Roy, Douglas Taylor, Amanda Weinert, Janan Cotto, Yabashan Oldshield, Marie Richards, Lakota Hobia, Lynn Bardwell, and Ron Yob. Also, thank you to the Grand Rapids Public Library, the Grand Rapids Public Museum, Seidman House, and Bentley Library, where I conducted research and who helped me find these materials. What I do well is due to the difficult decisions and resilience of my ancestors. What I do poorly is mine and mine alone. I come to you with a good heart and in a good way. So the title of my presentation is Taking the Back Roads, Stories of the Getza Anishinaabeg Trails and Relationship to Mounds. So let's get started. So this project came out of my interest in telling the lived experiences of Anishinaabeg, past, present, and future, through the Anishinaabeg trails and the creation of the highway system here in Michigan. What this research revealed was that the trails and the mounds have always been interconnected. And so today I'm going to tell three kinds of stories. Stories of the Getza Anishinaabeg, stories of settler violence upon those mounds, and stories of generations of Anishinaabeg working together to protect the mounds. So I hope this information leads us to develop more concrete ways to support the sovereignty and cultural continuance of local tribal nations people. In my experience, when there is a discussion around Indigenous mounds, they are typically discussed out of historical and cultural and regional context. We receive details like the following: assertion that they were created by a lost people. Some may or may not concede that there is a relationship between those people and the current Indigenous people of that area. Stories of excavation, vandalism, and desecration, and stories of public use. I will highlight a lot of the stories of excavation and public use to tell another story of the creation of Grand Rapids and its relationship to the First People. So I want to begin by talking about the trails of the Getza Anishinaabeg. Our trails were mainly inland and through rivers and highway water level streams. Some of these trails were also footpaths. At times, we used the paths of buffalo herds, and our maps were not written but passed down and remembered. We used our seasonal practices and life ways to guide us. And so I wanted to share some of these photos first of when I talk about the Getza Anishinaabeg, I'm talking about the old Anishinaabeg. And I'm using that phrase for a specific reason because of the ways that the stories of Michigan and the mounds have framed the mound builders in a certain kind of homogenetic, universal, lost people kind of way. And so from my archival research, these are some of the images of the Getza Anishinaabeg at different times of our history. And so this right here is actually the foot trails that I was talking about before, is that there's this story that I was very obsessed with for a very long time and continue to be, is that Michigan would make this argument that our highways and our trails were interconnected. And I wanted to show you this map from my archival research, which is these are some of the foot trails that the Getza Anishinaabeg used. We also use trail markers like these. So in this picture, Elder Frank Sprague, and this picture was taken by Lynn Bardwell, is sitting on a marker tree that he found on his way to the UP. And so Frank and Lynn sent me this picture because of the questions I was asking about marker trees. The other image are two settlers in Grand Rapids who have a marker tree on their property. The Getza Anishinaabeg would bend and shape young hardwood trees. There were multiple kinds of marker trees, including trail marker trees, directional trees, sites for copper and lead deposits, chipping stations, and caves where we stashed materials. We use these trees to designate territorial boundaries of agreements we had with different tribal nations regarding travel and hunting and land use. These trees also marked freshwater springs and to locate medicinal plants. Sometimes these trails were waterways. The Getza Anishinaabeg would pick up their birch bark jaman, a canoe, and carry it to the next part where the waterway was deep enough to canoe or kayak. I guess I would say kayak because of whatever. But I just want to just have you think about that for a second and how strong the Anishinaabeg ancestors are in this moment where they're literally They're traveling through waterways, they're picking up their canoe, they're hoisting it on their shoulder, they're walking to the next part of the trail, and then they get in and keep going. So, multiple modern highways and roads were modeled after these trails. Land surveyors identified these trails as the best places for modernized roads due to concerns around flooding, near settlement towns, etc. But the whole road is not the actual trail step for step. Surveyors also responded to settlers' needs who did not want to go through dense forests and swamplands, so they changed the paths while still maintaining the story that these were the original trails. The trails and the mounds are interconnected. They are embedded into the trails as resting places, sites of diplomacy, and ceremonial. Where the trails were often at a lower level, the mounds were often built at higher water levels. This was for many reasons, due to an awareness of flooding during the spring and the early topography of Michigan. The Getza Anishinaabeg used the knowledge of water levels to clean and clear camps. Before settlement and industry, Michigan was actually rolling hills and not flatlands. One example is near Godfrey and Cesar Chavez Avenue. That area reflects some of the earlier parts of Grand Rapids. Looking at early land surveying decisions, I've learned that the placement of mounds often occurred around hemlock, birch, white pine, and elm trees. And when I shared this with Lakota Hobia, she's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Gun Lake, she thinks that made sense and reflected early diplomacy relationships that the Getza and Anishinaabeg had with neighboring nations. These trees reflected our making practices. Grand Rapids had so many council trees, including one on Fulton, that city members destroyed around 1900. As Eric Hemingway shares, council trees was a marker tree where chiefs would gather to practice governance and deliberation. Before the pollution of industry and settlement, Grand Rapids was rich with resources. Around the mounds, there were wild berry brambles, monoman beds, mulberry trees, wild plum orchards, and crabapple trees. Near the Black Hills neighborhood is where the Getza and Anishinaabeg harvested mushrooms and benefited from walnut and butternut trees. In the distance of the mounds were cornfields and elaborate gardens. There are so many stories that settlers tell about the history of Grand Rapids, the history of the Getza and Anishinaabeg and their relationship to the mounds. I argue that most public knowledge on mounds is from a settler perspective. It's stories of settler occupation and conquest. And I'm going to tell some of those stories now, but from an Anishinaabeg perspective. And so some of the settler stories I'm talking about are as follows. So here is a timeline and a list of my research and of those who wrote about this. And so if you look, from the 17th to 19th century, we have the story of excavated and robbed mounds. There were stories around who created the mounds, again, this idea of the lost people, because just like most settlers at this time, they couldn't fathom the idea that the actual indigenous people from that area could be intellectual enough to build these things. No laws to recognize the protection of mounds until about 1990. Archaeologists, anthropologists, land surveyors, and logging and lumber companies were responsible for a lot of the damage of the mounds. And then around in these stories also are the creation of bridges in the late 19th century that I learned led to the raising of the mounds. The mounds near Plainfield trading posts were also destroyed by lumberjacks. 1915, 1960s, 1980s, and the 2000s also explained the further excavation that these archaeologists and anthropologists and land surveyors have done on ancestral territory and of the mounds in the Grand Rapids area. So anyway, this last part of this slide here is that the materials and the remains from those excavations were sent to Grand Valley State University, the Peabody Museum, and of course the Grand Rapids Public Museum. So according to Hinsdale, who created an extensive atlas that comprised of Anishinaabeg villages, trails, camps, and mounds, there were at least 1,068 mounds in Michigan by the early 19th century. In Grand Rapids, there were about 40 mounds total. So this map here is one from that Hinsdale atlas, which actually, if you are a Grand Valley State University student, you can go to The archivist Rapinski, whose first name I can't remember right now, but she's excellent, and pull out this atlas at the Seidman Archives. Folks like Thomas Porter and Coffinberry argued that these mounds were burial sites. They were council areas for diplomacy. They were sites of ceremony. Sometimes the mounds were embedded as a part of earthworks. Which refers to larger enclosed structures. Coffinberry and Strong excavated 46 mounds. They published their findings in proceedings with the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1876. These mounds varied from 2 feet to 15 feet in height and 10 feet to 102 feet in diameter. At this time, settlers assigned meaning to these mounds in a variety of ways. Coffinberry identified the mounds as a refuse heap, identifying the shells, the ashes, and the bones as trash. They relied on the memoirs of Rix Robinson, Louis Campeau, and Charles Belknap as authorities on the First Peoples' perspectives and histories. Yet, there are also inconsistent reports from Robinson, Campeau, and Belknap. In their writings, there is evidence where they acknowledge that the Kutsche Anishinaabeg were the builders of these mounds, and also when settlers were directly asked about them, they would say their Indian confidants had no idea about these mounds. While reading through primary materials, I want to be clear that the goal of these documents was to catalog and to count. They reported on numbers, dimensions, and locations. All of their analysis about the purpose and culture of the Kutsche Anishinaabeg is through the speculation and at a time when Euro settlers were not interested in coexisting with the First People. They wanted to eliminate us, and they were looking to their own cultural practices as a way to do so. So let's put this into larger historical context. At this time, when land surveyors, landowners, and founders were making decisions about the future of Michigan and advocating for it to become a state, there was a lot of concern over who was here first. To maintain the arguments of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism, it benefited settlers to tell another story of the First People, that the mound builders were an ancient race who disappeared. This is at a time when the government was trying to find any evidence that the indigenous people were gone and that the people who were here were less intelligent, more primitive groups who did not have a right to this land or to decision making. This was at a time when the federal government was engaging in treaty making that was duplicitous and non-consensual. In my research, from the early 19th century to the 1980s, I have read countless documents by Grand Rapids settlers and founders who describe the mounds as an Indian problem. This is important to understand as it reflects the common belief of the early 1800s when settlers did not think they could coexist with the First People. I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of stories that we can tell about early mound excavation and preservation. Scientists and land surveyors were interested in these mounds because it told them something about how the First People used this landscape and the natural resources. It told them about their access to copper, different kinds of lumber, to understand high water areas. These mounds told them a story about the kinds of soil and how the Kutsche Anishinaabeg hunted, farmed, and foraged. To make a generalization, my ancestors, were not human to these peoples. We were objects to be studied, categorized, and then sent to museums and universities to be displayed as symbols of conquest. This is a map. Going further into how this context impacted Michigan and Grand Rapids, in my research from land surveyors, geologists, and geographers, it's become very clear that the roads, water levels, and the topography of Michigan was a problem for settlers. French settlers from the 17th and 18th centuries did not create roads. Instead, they used the trails of the Anishinaabeg, and they would canoe alongside the coast of the Great Lakes. Our trails were foot trails and herd trails that traveled mainly inland through thick forests. It was not suitable for wagons. In the 19th century, there was ongoing discussion of who would create these roads. Settlers would not come to Michigan until there was a more fully established travel system that made sense for their understanding of time, mobility, and technology. They also needed surveyors to raise the land and make it flat. They needed wetlands, swamps, and bogs to be filled in because they did not understand how to farm or live among the original landscape of Michigan. For example, one of my favorite anecdotes is that Royal Oak, which is where I grew up, was actually 20 miles of a cranberry bog, and it took settlers 3 days to travel around it in order to get what it is now to Pontiac. How we understand Grand Rapids, how we move through Michigan, is reflective of the beliefs, values, and knowledge of settlers and their lifeways. So taking us to this map now, this is a bird's eye view map of Grand Rapids in 1868. So as you can see, the islands were still a part of the Grand River. The early construction of Grand Rapids was designed to appeal to trading. They used the Grand River as a sewer to ship raw materials. What I hope becomes clear is that the settlers of Grand Rapids, they were uninterested in learning how to live within an already established ecosystem and topography, and instead created a new landscape that reflected a domination over nature and people. So this is an image of the Millennium Park boundary, which is where some of the remaining mounds still are. So the creation of bridges, railroads, and roads were interconnected to support industry and settlement. The first rail line through the area was the Chicago and Michigan Lakeshore Railroad in 1869. In 1873, a landowner allowed that corridor to pass through his property, which is about 250 feet of the easternmost mound. Janet Brashler argues that this was the first serious brush with the historic era disturbance. I would disagree and argue that the creation of trade posts and early robbing and excavation was. This can be further illustrated through the creation of these highways. So the creation of highways is a story of settler colonialism, environmental injustice, gentrification, and white supremacy. When US 131 was created, it was created like all highways to support high volumes of traffic, to leave urban areas, and so drivers did not have to go near what politicians refer to as slum areas. If looking at a map, one can see that this highway goes through key villages and sacred areas of the Geta Anishinaabeg. When the US 131 was built in 1926, it was done without the input of the community. It displaced residents. To authorize the creation of this highway, they reinforced the story that this highway was the best location because it reflected the old Geta Anishinaabeg trails. I mentioned before that settlers described the mounds as an Indian problem, yet it was not because of the mounds as a problem, but because another generation of Anishinaabeg were seeking to hold the city accountable for grave robbing, displaying of ancestral remains, and general cultural insensitivity, and a lack of community input and consultation. I want to tell those stories right now. Also, right from the Seidman archives. First, I want to begin with a story that community member and 1974 editor of Turtle Talk, Shirley Francis, wrote about the Grand Rapids and the mounds. This is a long story. Scene 1. It is 2,000 years ago. A grand river flows in the broadly angling way that rivers do through a wide, low valley. Not far beyond the last rapids, on its way to a great lake. The lush greenery that decks the banks gives way to a clearing. Here, up from the river's edge, 200 yards or so, some 17 mounds rise gracefully to varying heights from a grassy, blossom-filled meadow. Closest to the river are small ones, elevated a mere 2 or 3 feet. Beyond larger ones rise to 15 feet. The random patterning of this size and spacing is a pleasant contrast to the carefully laid out adjacent village to the left of them. The bright morning sun combines with the dew to give a crystalline shimmer over all. The village is already bustling with activity, but this day is different from yesterday. From countless generations, the village has gathered her brood of mounds to her guarding, nourishing, mending them. In return, they have provided numerous generations of children a safe place to play, and many generations of courting couples a rendezvous in their shadows. Today, this has ended. The village and mounds must part. The last great chief has died. The last basketful of dirt has been laid carefully onto the last mound. Beneath 20,000 hand-carried basketfuls of earth, his body has been laid to rest forever. The mound people are preparing to leave. Perhaps the chief left no heir, and the people have elected to return to their ancient capital many days to the south. Perhaps the climate has grown colder, causing crops to fail and their numbers to diminish. The sturdier may have become hunters and gatherers, eventually wandering far to the north where all the memory of the mounds was lost in the everyday struggle. Everything is packed. First, the people must say goodbye, strolling through their beloved mounds, cradling for the bones of their ancestors. They whisper a prayer for the happy repose of the spirits that hover near. The mound spirits hover about, waiting, waiting. Someday the people will return. Yes, they will return. Scene 3. Not far from the mounds, a great metropolis has risen up. There, in a building, gather some 70 people who have responded to a call from an organization to be formed that they will do something about the mounds. They will call themselves the Friend of the Mounds, and they will plan a way to make the mounds a safe, sacred space again. The descendants, now called Native Americans, are there, but most are newcomers to the Grand River and its valley, and there are new ways for working together. They form clusters. One calls itself the Museum Association, another the Museum Officials. One cluster is called the Anthropologists, another is known as the Local Archaeological Society. One cluster is made up of just plain citizens, but all recognize the priceless heritage of the mounds. All realize there is no other place like the mounds in the entire peninsula, now christened Michigan. But interest has been shown before. Will this new group be able to sustain itself against the trials facing it? Protecting the mounds from further rape and desecration will require time, money, talent, effort, and dedication. All about the mound spirits wait. Perhaps, just perhaps, the people are returning. So I just read 2 scenes from her writings, and it's all throughout Turtle Talks. So I've reviewed hundreds of newsletters written by Anishinaabeg from the 1960s to the early 00s. From powwows to advocating for policies, these newsletters reflected the activism of our elders. I want to highlight examples of local activism and the mounds where community members worked with the American Indian movement to defend and clean up the mounds. At this time, the concerned Indians of Michigan, Friends of the Mounds, and other tribal nations people were pressuring the state and federal government to be more culturally sensitive around the excavation of mounds and villages. They would show up to the Archaeological Society meetings, city commission meetings, and so on to make their perspectives visible. So they made the news consistently regarding the cleaning up and protecting of the mounds when it was used as a dump site. And so these are 2 examples here. Fred Chivis, who I'll talk about or refer to later, is a known community member and elder, as well as his descendants. Their efforts resulted in the presence of Indigenous people on advisory councils for excavation. Their presence and activism resulted in NAGPRA. In other words, up until the 1970s, there were no policies to include, consult, or inform Indigenous people of excavations. It was completely acceptable to remove and display remains. I want to draw attention to one example of this. From the 1960s to the 1970s, there was a city commission meeting on the mounds. I just came from a city commission meeting yesterday. City commission committee. Until 1975, there was no Native people on that commission. I want to acknowledge the elders who comprise that committee now. John Bozen Jr., Frank Bush, Ron Yob, Lauren Shenaniquit, Isaac Peters, June Gorman, Michael Dominic, Fred Chivis Jr., and Rosalie Star Chief. These elders put forward agenda items like removing ancestor remains from public display at the museum and to transfer the custody of the remains to the museum and tribal nations. That last request was denied because the commission, which was made of public servants and archaeologists and museum directors, chose to listen to the archaeological societies and academics who demanded that they needed to study those remains in the name of science. So as I end here, I want to return to the ideas of sovereignty, story, resistance, and survival. I hope that what becomes clear is that the Getza Anishinaabeg and their later generations always worked in multiple strategies to protect, educate, and care for these mounds in our communities, whether academics, politicians, and museum directors included them or not. And so I just kind of want to for the non-Native people who are in the audience to think about the stories that they've already accepted about Grand Rapids, the mounds, and the history of Michigan, and encourage you all to make space for Indigenous perspectives. I want us to challenge the idea that sovereignty and self-determination only occurs if the federal government chooses to recognize a tribal nation. Miigwech for listening. Thank you.
Bojo Jayek, Ndenman Maganuk, Jawanon des Nakas, Nko Ododem, Shishi Beniek and Debendagwes, Washington, Dayan, California, and Dochbia. So I'm Kaya DeerInWater, and as was previously mentioned, I live here in Grand Rapids, but I'm originally from California, one of the many products of the relocation era, if anyone's familiar with that. I'm Bear Clan, and I belong to the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma, removed Potawatomi folks. My original village site was, and family resided in just a little bit south of here along the banks of the St. Joseph River. And I am going to have a very loose conversation around Anishinaabe perspectives on the environment and how our agricultural practices are in line with stewardship, and how weaving the agricultural practices and food sovereignty into environmental stewardship can lead to greater environmental stewardship of the lands that we all live on right now. So Andrea mentioned briefly that the Anishinaabe are made of the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Chippewa, and I think it's interesting that we have a Potawatomi tribal member, a Chippewa tribal member, and an Odawa tribal member here. So we are representing the three fires with the three of us, although we are not speaking for our nations. We are just here as people, as ourselves. And so in understanding who and what the Anishinaabe people are, I think it's important to start with our worldview. And our worldview is based in our languages, so Bodewadmi Moen or Anishinaabe Moen, and that our languages are vastly different than English. We speak from a verb-centric point of view. 80% of our language is verbs and only 20% nouns. It is almost flipped for English. English is predominantly nouns and very few verbs. So the way that we talk to each other and express our ideas and our creativity is very different than we do today in the lingua franca of English. But it is also about another key difference I'd like to point out is that our worldview starts with positivity. It starts with positive intent, and we assume that people are born whole and complete, which is a little bit different than the dominant Western worldview, which assumes that people are broken and that there's original sin and that you have to mend that relationship. So our worldview also rests on the alliances and the relationality between all of our kin, and our kin are not just the people that we are born genetically related to. Our kin are much broader, and it includes all of our animal relatives, all of our plant relatives, all of the water beings, all of the spirits, the deities, the more than human relatives. So in that sense, when we're talking about environmental stewardship or agricultural stewardship or about history, it is not discrete, it is holistic. And another key aspect to our worldview that I think often gets cited a lot is that our cultures are based in reciprocity and generosity. and gift giving is a big part of not only Anishinaabe lifeways, but part of most indigenous lifeways across Turtle Island. So that these foundational aspects of our culture kind of play into how the land is cared for, how the relatives are cared for, how we all care for each other. And so our agricultural practices can narrowly be defined as practices that cultivate rich gardens of primarily madamen or corn, but beans and squash and sunflowers as well. Many of you know the Three Sisters is what that polyculture is called. And it is noted, I'm sure Andrea and you all, because you're all history buffs. I'm not a history buff. I'm an ecologist, a plant nerd. So pardon me for any mistakes that I make in a history context. So yeah, as Andrea was saying, Andrea and you all may know that the cornfields and mounds, and not mounds in the sense of Andrea, but mounds as in corn hills, dotted the landscape all over Michigan, and there's lots of documentation of that. And these weren't just small little cornfields. Some of them were up to 500 acres, and it has been shown by academics, modern academics, indigenous academics like Jane Mount St. Pleasant, who is a Haudenosaunee agronomist, and her work has shown that Three Sisters agriculture supports the highest density of people of any other cropping system across Turtle Island. You can get nearly 14 people per acre. You can feed them for a year off of Three Sisters agriculture. So when you see the monocultures of GMO corn, and all of those inputs, all of the synthetic fertilizers and stuff, just remember that our ancestors were feeding more people than anywhere else on earth off of our Three Sisters with very minimal inputs and just based on our thousands of years of indigenous knowledge and teachings. But that agriculture is also based in a rotational cycle. We didn't deplete the soil so much. Our practices didn't deplete the soil so much that we had to continually input. And there's been some great work recently in the last decade or so from Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. Does anybody follow the gardens that were rediscovered over there in Wisconsin? Okay, I'll tell you. The Menominee for forever thought that, or not forever, for the last couple generations thought that they weren't agriculturalists because they had no record and no knowledge of agricultural practices within their tribe. But then doing surveys, the forest surveys that they do for their sustainable yield management, they discovered that there were these areas in the corners of the reservation that hadn't been well documented that had fields, cornfields, ridges and rows and mounds. And then when the soil scientists came in and dug trenches, they found that the gardening practices, the agricultural practices that the Menominee were using hundreds and thousands of years ago were, they left the land and the soil in a better condition than before the gardens. And so I'd like that little bit to resonate with you all, that agriculture doesn't have to be a destructive practice. It can be a regenerative practice. And so those Menominee folks who gardened in northern Wisconsin, mind you, they were growing corn in northern Wisconsin. So that should tell you something about their ingenuity. They did things like they pulled when after the harvest of wild rice, I'm not sure if anyone knows, but you have to thresh it, you have to parch it, there's a lot of processing of wild rice to make it the food that we know today. But all of that material, all of that organic material was then thrown onto the fields. So it was added back into the fields. So you're taking corn, you're taking biomass off the fields, but then you're also adding it in. And because wild rice is an aquatic plant, it has a completely different nutrient profile. And so does its vegetative biomass. It is basically like pulling up the nutrients from the bottom of the lakes and rivers and putting it on our cornfields. And then on top of that practice, those folks also pulled that actual muck from the lakes and rivers and put it on the fields. So they are adding more organic matter to their gardens. And there was a lot of ingenuity in the way that the gardens were arranged and placed. And if it was a dry year, they would be placed perpendicular to the river. If it was a wet year, they would be placed or the other way around. If it was a dry year, they would be placed perpendicular to the river. If it was a wet year, they would be placed parallel to the river. And that just is about water retention, and you don't want your crops to get waterlogged. So all of that to be said, that our agricultural practices are regenerative, and with a little support and resurgence and rekindling of those practices, I believe we can better support indigenous food sovereignty, tribal food sovereignty. And one of those aspects is land. Like there's not really anybody in Michigan growing large scale indigenous corn at this point that I know of. So access to land is one of the hardest things. If you ask any farmer, any new farmer or old farmer, they will always tell you that access to land is paramount to the success in farming. And as the indigenous peoples of this land, I think it's kind of sad that there isn't an indigenous farmer who's growing indigenous corn on a scale that could feed communities, because that should be taking place. That really should. And so that is one place where I have tried to fill the gap, and I partnered with a non-indigenous farmer and grew a 1/4 acre of corn last year. And it's a variety of flint corn that was developed by Tecumseh in Prophetstown, Indiana. And Tecumseh, who all knows of Tecumseh? Okay, good. Good. So I'm not you all know somewhat about. So his village was comprised of the 29 tribes that supported his rebellion, right? And so there were people from the Cherokee Nation, there were people from the Osage Nation, there were people, all different kinds of people. And so this corn that I grew last year is really, I think it's kind of special in that way, because we as indigenous people are now a mixture of a whole bunch of different nations, and we've really always been a mixture of a whole bunch of different nations. I mean, our alliances and our economic system and our governance structure as Anishinaabe people was built on a network of alliances far and wide. I mean, they found, early explorers found sugar maple cakes in Louisiana, right, in New Orleans. The nearest maple from New Orleans is thousands of miles north of there. So we were traders. We were always trading, and things like maple sugar are delicious. And so, of course, we would trade them far and wide, and they would get places very, very broadly. But the Tecumseh's flint corn was an amalgamation of these 29 tribes. And we as Native peoples here in the city of Grand Rapids are made of lots of different tribes. My family is Cherokee. Dakota, and Potawatomi from my native side. And so I think having that that intersectional identity of being multi-tribal is something that should be leaned into more, and that we all bring different gifts to the table, and all our different heritage bring different gifts to the table. So even though there isn't a lot of gardening, of indigenous gardening on the scale of feeding the community, it doesn't take that much. It just takes a few conversations, some nice people, and a lot of work, because growing corn is not easy, especially growing corn without machines, with just hand practices. But it also is so much more rewarding, and it supports not only food sovereignty, it supports public health, it supports nutrition, it supports community engagement, it supports, like, it is an activity that was the center of our culture, and should be the center of our culture again. And it is an intergenerational activity. I take my kids out there, and so I think it's time that we, as Indigenous people in Grand Rapids, have access to more corn, more indigenously grown corn. And so, just a little plug for Madaman, or corn. Another example of how our culture and practices enhance environmental stewardship is our Madaman, or our Manuman. And Manuman means the good seed. It is wild rice, as it's known in English, and it is foundational. It is a staple crop. It is a sacred crop. And it is not wild in the sense that we all think or talk about it in everyday language, because it is a lot of work, and its presence and dominance in our culture is due to our ancestors' dedication to maintaining the relationship to wild rice. And wild rice is nutritionally amazing, and it is spiritually amazing, and it is also, and from a kind of compartmentalized and environmental perspective, it's an indicator species. It is really sensitive to environmental degradation, and so it requires high water quality, good water quality, and good habitat. And so that's partly why you don't see a lot of it around here anymore, and it's mostly been extirpated from the lower peninsula. And there's one place kind of in the far east central of the lower peninsula that has lakes and rivers that are still dominated by it. But those allowing Native peoples to continue our relationship with our food relatives and our staple crops would go a long way to enhancing the environmental stewardship of Lower Michigan, of Michigan in general, and of Turtle Island, or the world, really, because as Indigenous people, we only make up 20% of the Earth's population, and yet we safeguard 80% of the biodiversity. So it's that age-old 80-20 ratio. I think that's about it for me. I'll hand it over to the next participant. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening to me ramble a little bit about my perspectives on Indigenous environmental stewardship.
Hello, everybody. Ani Buju. My name is Camren Stott, and I am a chef here in Grand Rapids, born and raised, Grand Rapids, Michigan. So just to talk a little bit about myself and what I do, we're going to be touching down a little bit today, expanding a little more on Indigenous food sovereignty. I'll try not to duplicate because I know Kaya did an amazing job so eloquently describing all the details of Indigenous food sovereignty. So I will try not to duplicate. So my name is Camren Stott. Once again, I have a very complicated relationship with my identity. I have been a chef. I have been cooking. Oh, let's back up. I have been cooking for about 12, 13 years. I have been a chef for about 5 to 6. And I've always had a very complicated relationship with my identity, with food, access to food. And the scope of my work and what I do kind of started with the 2019 Great Lakes Food Summit. It was my first introduction to Indigenous food. And I was surrounded by Indigenous chefs that I've never met. And I knew in that day that I had formed lifelong bonds with a lot of different people. So re-indigenizing food systems is something that is a passion of mine that has been the focal point of my career for about the past 5 years now. So what that looks like is just integrating traditional food practices with contemporary culinary arts. And that's what I do. I use my skills as a chef to change the way that I interact with certain foods. I feel as being a chef wasn't enough for me. I always had wondered why I had such limited knowledge and such limited connection with the food that I was preparing. And as a chef, I feel like it was my responsibility to learn more. So I kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone. And that also made me wonder, like, what about Indigenous food? I know nothing about that. I don't know anybody who does, you know? And that kind of became a gateway to combining my experiences in the kitchen and forming and beginning to form and create my ideal of my identity. So I work with a group called iCollective. We are Indigenous chefs, seed keepers, storytellers who want to collaborate to transform our interactions with food from a food justice perspective. So I transitioned into more of an educator and advocacy role in my work as a chef. So that required me to learn more about my own culture through food. And then I had such an amazing experience with that I want to share that with other people. So that's just a little bit about myself. So I know that Andrea and Kaya probably already, touched down on this, but I can't reiterate how important this is that the interdependent relationship with the land. So that spiritual bond is real. It's something that Native people, Anishinaabe, Native people all on Turtle Island have developed over years and years and years. This spiritual bond with the land. Viewing the land as a living, breathing being, right? Viewing the land as an entity deserving of respect and reciprocal respect, right? And so we do that through sustainable practices, right? So our traditional practices have always been very important in our relationship and living in harmony with the earth and the sentiment of preserving our environment and the earth and the land that gives to us for the generations ahead, because we're not thinking in this instant moment. We're thinking 7 generations ahead, right? Which has a lot of relevance today. It's important to note that the historical context of Indigenous food systems is very relevant in that it relates and correlates a lot with a lot of the sustainable practices that are being put in place today by our non-Indigenous counterparts. So when we talk about indigenous food systems, obviously there's a lot of historical context related to that. One of the biggest disruptions, the colonial disruption, right? We think about how our deep-rooted connection to the land has been severed, right? And this doesn't just affect indigenous people, but all people. You think about when you don't source local food, you don't buy a local food, we don't know where it comes from. We know nothing about it, right? It's very common to, and even for me, for quite a long time, to not really know where my food is coming from, or not knowing like certain things about food that you would think like, I should know that as a chef. Why don't I know that? Why don't I know that this is actually a root vegetable, right? So, despite the loss of our traditional knowledge and the rise of health disparities, our communities have been resilient, right? We have seen this resurgence in revitalizing our ancestral practices. We are a resilient people, right? So, because of that colonial disruption, because of colonial disruption in the form of mass production, in the form of monoculture, right, that has severed our connection, this is not just a historical challenge, but a contemporary challenge that we face today, right? The historical policies that have been put into place threaten our attempts to preserving our food sovereignty, land rights, right? So in order to, and I'll get more into this, but in order to kind of like repair that damage, indigenous food systems, that traditional wisdom is our way of reestablishing our relationship with the land. So the importance of the indigenous food systems, I wanted to expand kind of more on that, right? A holistic solution to health, to addressing health, right? There is this misconception that Western modern medicine, modern methodologies and research are the only way to validate and to justify our health disparities and the affliction on indigenous populations, right? So indigenous food systems embody that sustainability, right? We deviate from that Western view of nourishment in that when we talk about indigenous food systems, we aren't talking about just our physical health, right? We're talking about our spiritual health and how our indigenous foods not only nourish our physical body, but also our spiritual being, right? And that kind of leads us into the cultural significance of Menomen, Kyle was talking about. Menomen is not seen as just sustenance, right? It is sacred. It is a sacred food, right? Because it does much more. We don't just limit ourselves to thinking about physical health. Physical health is very, very important, but our spiritual health too, when we talk about our connection with food, which kind of, leads us into tying it in with the topic of environmental stewardship. So by preserving biodiversity and practicing ecological stewardship, indigenous food systems offer lessons in sustainable living for all. And I will dive more into this, but I don't believe that indigenous food systems are outdated ways of addressing some of the modern challenges that we face today. I believe that it is very important to have indigenous perspective in how are we going to solve these very contemporary problems that we all face today. And I believe that looking to indigenous stewardship and indigenous wisdom is a way to offer kind of a lens and how we can collaborate in addressing some of these environmental problems, right? Because there's global relevance. It's faced all over the world. We're all in this together, right? Food insecurity and climate change. So indigenous food systems, restoring health. I kind of have been deviating from the word decolonize lately. And I like the term re-indigenizing because I did try the decolonized diet for 30 days. And I felt like it was very restrictive, right? And it was very, very hard to do. So I kind of want to look at the flip side of using the term re-indigenizing diets, introducing indigenous foods into our diet so it's not as restrictive of a term. But it's not just about returning to traditional foods, and that's why I like re-indigenizing diet, but just revitalizing our health, culture, and connection to the earth, right? Because it's not about restriction, it's about reintroducing and translating into the modern context. So this re-indigenizing our diets, because of the way that indigenous food systems have this natural inclination because of that relationship with the land, in return, it promotes and emphasizes sustainability. When we talk about local and seasonal food, like that ties into indigenous food systems, right? When we talk about indigenous food systems, we're not just talking about food to consume, we're also talking about our environmental footprint, promoting biodiversity, right? So my personal commitment in working in indigenous food systems as a chef is striving to incorporate those traditional ingredients and practices, right? And bridging that gap between ancestral wisdom and modern cuisine. Like, how can we translate this into the modern context in order to, figure out how to develop an idea of what indigenous cuisine looks like. It's also important to note that without food accessibility and sovereignty, that indigenous food systems can't flourish. Sovereignty is a right, right? Food sovereignty goes beyond just access, right? So it's about the right to define our own food systems. What Kaya was talking about too, like land access is a huge, huge, huge barrier. And as indigenous people and stewards of the land, it seems off that it's so hard to access land, to grow our traditional foods and to feed our community, right? So in order for this community success, for these initiatives to be successful, land sovereignty is a very important component in achieving that. And so when we talk about indigenous food systems, and when we talk about just food access and self-determination in any marginalized community that faces barriers to food access, food sovereignty is a right that everybody has inherently. So, and then this is the burning question, right, of how do we move forward together? Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, we inhabit the land and we equally have the responsibility of stewarding the land, right? So collaboration. Our sustainable future is really very dependent on our collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous community, sharing knowledge and respect. That knowledge sharing and respect component is very important, right? Because I feel like, especially in Grand Rapids, Indigenous communities our Indigenous community doesn't have the platform that it deserves in order to address some of these health disparities within our community and nationwide. So as a call to action, I invite each of you to explore how you can support these efforts, whether it's through advocacy, education, or just personal choices that respect and honor Indigenous traditions. Utilizing your platform, whatever that may be, introducing these concepts into your personal life through education, educating yourselves about the Indigenous people in your community and the efforts and looking for a way to turn this willingness to help into actionable items. So just a little bit of additional information about me. There's a link to my articles, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for all of our presenters. And now I think that we have maybe 20 minutes-ish for questions and answers, depending on the audience. I could come up with my own questions. I'm sure you all have questions you could discuss, but I wanted to go to the audience first and give you all the chance.
Okay, so this might be for Kaya. Have you connected with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory over at MSU at all?
I have not officially. I have looked them up and been curious about them, but no.
Okay, I'm also a plant nerd, so it's really fun. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Hi, this is a question for the whole panel, and I'm coming here from Toronto. I'm not familiar very much with it's my first time to Michigan. I really appreciated all of your presentations, and I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about these mounds in the present. You've all discussed them a little bit in your presentations, and I wondered to what extent, if you could talk a little bit about access, and if you could to your own people, and ongoing ceremonial use in the present, whether that is something that continues to happen, whether there is any relationship with food and food growing in and around these mounds. You talked about, Andrea, about brambles and about wild cherry orchards and so on. If you could just talk about the present. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello? Okay, it's good. So the city of Grand Rapids still owns the mounds, and they engaged in, I'm trying to think of the word. So they have a lease agreement with the Grand Rapids the Grand Rapids Public Museum. They've had that agreement since the 1970s. And that agreement was a really kind of complicated decision that was based off of the city of Grand Rapids saw it as a problem, and they just didn't want to deal with it. And they were like, you museum directors want this, take it. You can be the stewards. And I would say the current staff of the Grand Rapids Museum really understands stewardship and relationships. And so, you know, in the present, the mounds continued for a while to be used as a dumping ground. So Ron Yob, who is the chairman for the Grand River Band, he has really been one of the major advocates for protecting the mounds. They're currently gated, so that way people don't use them as a dumping ground still. Him, along with the museum, has done some really important work around keeping the banks from not eroding. There has been some really complicated conversations within community of like, maybe we should just let the mounds go, because for some people they think that that's kind of what the original intention is that our ancestors built them, and that when they eroded, they should erode and then go back into the water or the land. Some relatives disagree with that and want to keep them. So how it works is that it's a really interesting kind of system where Ron, I believe, has a key to the fence or the gate. And if people want to go in and do ceremony or a cleanup, they still do a yearly cleanup. He'll do that, and that's kind of it. The Grand Rapids Public Museum has an Anishinaabe community member on staff who's responsible for kind of gathering those contemporary perspectives on what to do next, which I think is a pretty appropriate plan.
No, actually, I feel like you did an amazing job of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add because the mounds that I was talking about were cornfields. So,
But yeah, sorry, but I think that's what's really important is like, in my research, so before doing my research, it was very much like the mounds are isolated from everything else, right? But talking with Kaya and doing my research, like when you go out there, you see it's a very intentional space, and they were created to think about hemlock, to think about access to food, to think about access to water, and rethinking that story as like those were just large hills that maybe we put our ancestors' remains in and that's it, and not the case, right?
This is for Kaya. You mentioned that wild rice and Lower Peninsula might have a home somewhere on the east side of the state. Do you know exactly where that is, and do they do any programming around that?
I know that last ricing season, there was a group that went out, a group of native and non-native folks. I believe it was a local conservation group that kind of organized it. Andrea, do you know more about that workshop or event?
Well, that was, isn't that Native people? Did they might be able to help in the short thing?
Anyways, there is active participation and community, and a collaborative sense too, because like Cam mentioned, it's going to take all of us doing the work together to move forward and to have a real shot at a sustainable future.
Thank you. Let me go over here to Gina.
This is for Kaya. It's a rather simple question, but I was a little confused if there's indigenous corn or indigenously grown corn. Are they the
It's
same?
all indigenous corn. It's the crop is from North America. It's from Turtle Island. But yes, I would say that that there is what I was referring to as indigenous corn is a variety that has been stewarded, a land race that has been stewarded by a specific set or specific group of indigenous folks for generations and generations. But there also is indigenously grown corn. There is a group in the Ute Mountain Tribe in Colorado grows not a heritage variety of their corn, but they grow it commercially on their farm and offer it for sale. So, so that there's a little bit of both going on.
This is for Andrea. Regarding the remains and the 3 institutions that have them, what's the status now? Is there a discussion of return of those remains?
It's been happening for quite a while. So Grand Valley claims that they have no more remains. I know that there are some tribal historic preservation officers that are part of a confederacy in Michigan that disagree with that claim. I know that Grand Rapids Public Museum is actively repatriating. One of the challenges around NAGPRA is that you have to know the known tribal nation to repatriate. And as we've already talked about in terms of diplomacy and alliances, like that's a really hard thing because tribal nations, in terms of being federally recognized or unrecognized, it's a construct that was created out of time and other kinds of aspects, right? So they do have some remains, from what I understand, or some artifacts. They work really intentionally with the community around the artifacts, and they are trying to understand who to repatriate those remains to. I'm not sure about the Peabody Museum. I'm pretty sure they still have it.
All right. Thank you.
Chimigwach to all of you. My question is, I guess, to the entire panel. Could you provide some examples of successful projects of rebuilding and restoration sovereignty food systems in Michigan, or perhaps even in the Great Lakes region in general? And my second question, kind of to piggyback on this, where do you see what is the role of non-Indigenous allies in supporting this movement? You mentioned one of the major challenges is the lack of the land. What are other challenges, and how we all can work on overcoming those challenges?
you want me to go first? Yeah. Always, okay. I'm in charge. I am Crane Clan, I guess it makes sense.
Yes, exactly.
First question was examples, right? Okay. So when Kaya was answering the question around the Monoman with the wild rice, I was thinking about my own wild ricing experiences where, you know, I go wild ricing with someone who the community has identified as like an ogama, like a chief of like wild ricing, right? And that's a traditional kind of role. And what she does is when it's wild ricing season, she talks with the rest of the ogamas or the chiefs of Monoman and says, is it time for us to rice? She takes community members out there. And then when we're out on the water, and I know what exact bed you're talking about, and I was like, don't tell people because it's a secret. And I'll get to that second question in a second around that right there. And so then we would learn the history and the techniques. And what I really appreciate about this one community member is that when we're out there learning how to harvest, it's not punitive. Like, it's very kind of like there are rules and expectations and protocols, but if you don't follow them, she's generous as a teacher and also as us as learners. And so, for example, I had learned that a lot of the Monoman beds in the Lower Peninsula are there not for Indigenous people's harvesting, but it's from the Department of Natural Resources feed those beds as a way to, support duck hunters in the area. And so Little Traverse Bay Band and Little River, for example, had tried to collaborate with the DNR around that kind of education and practices. I'm a forager and a harvester, so I'm very obsessed with things like mushrooms or wild rams, things like that. And so for me, I think one way to think about allyship is around stewardship and being attentive to foraging and harvesting relationships and practices. So ramp season's coming up. Be sustainable in your harvesting of ramps. Mushroom season is always here, but also it's coming up, and thinking about, chicken of the woods and head of the woods and like oyster mushrooms, and being intentional with only harvesting for what you need in the moment. And also really being thoughtful around how to give thanks. And as Kaya was saying, to really underscore that there are practices that we do that might seem destructive, but they're intentional to regenerate as well. And so being aware of that.
I would say, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. I would say that in my experience, some of kind of the barriers to like introducing Indigenous food systems and making that accessible for Indigenous communities, it's always been that like we try to, like, I personally, in my experience in nonprofit work, it's been very hard to do that because of the fact that I feel like the way that nonprofit work is structured in particular is kind of in direct conflict of like Indigenous values, like and just like how things are set up in general, especially with time. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm late all the time. I'm always running on Indian time. But our concept of time, is in direct conflict of Indigenous values, right? I think about the byproduct of colonialism, capitalism, mass production, and like needing to see results right away. Like in order to justify this, we need baseline data, we need biometrics, we need all this evidence in order to get funding, in order to do these things, and I feel like that is in direct conflict with Indigenous values. So it's been very difficult navigating the bureaucracy of nonprofits, working in nonprofits to try to delve into doing work around indigenous food sovereignty.
I would agree with Cam. And Andrea, sorry. Agree with everyone. And say that, yeah, our, like Andrew was mentioning, like Cam was mentioning, right now it's ramp season. I shouldn't be sitting here giving a talk. I should be out in the woods collecting ramps. That's my cultural responsibility, my spiritual responsibility as a Anishinaabe person. I'm supposed to be out there doing my duties as a good relative. And when ricing season comes, when maple season comes, when mushrooming comes, like the colonial time barrier is real. It is real, and it is felt like I feel it every day. That is a big barrier. I mean, like, who wants to give up an annual salary to go do those things? Who even has the ability, the privilege to do that, right? Like, living in a native lifestyle would mean sacrificing all of that kind of stuff. But there's definitely, that's not to say that it's black and white or this or that. There's definitely ways that you can incorporate things like going out during ramp season, or having an urban sugar bush, or taking an annual trip to go ricing. So there's little ways that you can integrate certain aspects of food sovereignty, but like a full-on, full-blown, robust, resilient food sovereignty, tribal food sovereignty, it would take the fall of capitalism, the fall of the U.S. empire, the fall of Christianity. You can go on and on and on, and it would be, but in that destruction, like Andrea was saying, there would be a rebuilding of life as well. But to answer the question, I do know of successful examples, not here in Michigan, but I have friends in Oneida, Wisconsin, who have formed an indigenous corn collective. There are 20 families that grow corn together all over that reservation. Now, they have a huge reservation and a very continuous land base, which I don't think any tribe in Michigan really has, so that's a challenge. But they've been doing it, and they've been doing it for about 8 or 9 years now, and it's grown from 5 families to 20 families. They spend all day, every day, growing corn, processing corn, shelling corn, eating corn, and it really is a community event, and it really has strengthened the bond between those community members, and it has also provided food for indigenous folks all over Wisconsin through different programs that support tribal elders or infants, mothers and infants, WIC. So there are successful examples of collectives forming independently from, say, tribal government programs or federal programs. Another one that I'm thinking of is a newly formed one. They're going to be growing flint corn on Madeline Island, and it's a collective of folks that, if anyone knows of Anishinaabe history and stories and prophecies, on Madeline Island is the place of chiefs. It is our cultural capital, so to speak, our spiritual capital. It's where all the deliberations and diplomacy from the most powerful chiefs all across the Great Lakes, all across Anishinaabeg came to meet and to counsel. And so the resurgence of growing flint corn on Madeline Island is a really powerful statement. Well, I forget the second part of the question.
You answered it. Oh,
Okay.
the allies thing.
Oh yeah, allies. Well, I think like they said, like the two panelists already mentioned, that it will take all of us working together. And so if anyone wants to give me land, I would gladly grow corn on land. Or even there are things like if you're a program manager or you in your position, whatever role your career is, there are ways that you can advocate and support Indigenous food sovereignty and Native folks, even if you're, say, an accountant or something. All Indigenous nonprofits probably need help with accounting. So, like, just because you're not like directly in the food sovereignty movement or environmental stewardship movement, you can definitely. Everybody has skills. Diversity is important.
And to add to that sentiment as well is even if you don't have something, like you're not in the position of power to make those policy changes or whatever is needed, it's really your personal connection with Indigenous communities, getting to know the Indigenous communities in like Kent County or Lansing or wherever you're at. It's really just going out and forming that bond and connection, educating yourself, attending events, and just getting to know more about the Indigenous people in your community is also a step forward as well.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more question. I don't know, or if it's been addressed.
Yeah, I guess my question is sort of a continuation of the last statement you were making about if anybody wants to give land. And I'm sort of wondering that, I know Grand Rapids a few years ago, the city no longer celebrates Columbus Day. Now they're saying Indigenous Peoples Day, which is great. But it at some level doesn't mean a whole lot unless there's action that follows with it. And I'm just wondering if there's been any effort or discussion, particularly amongst Anishinaabe people, about demanding or wanting land back that was taken from them. And if there's ways that, again, those of us who identify as allies could be supportive of that demand.
There is lots of conversations, and land back is, as a concept, as a movement, is very diverse. There's very militant folks in the land back movement, and then there's aunties and grandmas who talk about returning land-based practices, and there's a very diverse set of ideas and perspectives around land back, but it is definitely a gaining movement, and I feel like you hear about it every day in the news. I don't know about the local news, though. I'm not too keyed into the local news. Would you say there's a...
Hi, I work for the city.
Oh, yeah, and then, of course, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so
Take off your city hat.
Oh,
what do you really tell us?
I know. Stop the recording. I'm joking. So we had at one point tried to start a corn collective. So Parks and Rec, they do public gardens. So one thing I learned is that if community members ask for it, they will help a group of community members find a plot of land, and they were working with us about that very willingly. It's just as Kaya and Cam said, we're busy and we have to feed our families and we have to work, right? So I mean, there's one thing. I think in general, there's a lot of complicated feelings from settlers around like land rematriation, which is thinking about the public and private property conundrum. I'm not a big fan of the idea of private property personally. I feel like that's a really kind of settler colonial complicated issue. Direct things is go to the next city commission meeting and get your people and do it and go to public comment and say this is something you want to think of. Personally, I can tell you that I've been working with the executive office on thinking about how to engage with self-determination and sovereignty and cultural continuance practices. It's long work. Local tribal communities are very invested in it. Going back to an earlier question, a lot of this is often allowed when it comes to federal recognition. because Grand River has been denied twice around their own federal recognition, it makes it more difficult to engage in that kind of land repatriation because of how local governments operate, right? So again, going back to my closing statement, we have to, as a society, make arguments for thinking beyond the idea of recognized or unrecognized tribes as well. You know, those are big things. Little things, go to a public comment, right? Engage with what Cam has been saying, which is find ways to understand local needs here. We don't even have a friendship center or a Native cultural center. There's reasons for that. You know, we need funding, we need people to do this. And because of that issue around recognition, and it makes it very complicated.
And also, like Andrea and Cam mentioned, you know, there's a thing, and it's called a cultural tax, right?
Yeah.
We are 1% of the population of the area, and so the people who are doing the work, oftentimes a lot is on their plate. So that's where allyship would really come in handy, you know, supporting folks doing the good work, even if you are not Native or part of the Native community. We do need a lot of collaboration and support and help from a lot of different people in a lot of different ways.
All right, Cam, did you want to add anything or no?
That's perfect.
You're good? All right, okay, I didn't want to cut anybody off. So first of all, I would like to thank our panelists so much for giving of their time and knowledge to come here and share with us. So I think we should give them a big round of applause, for sure. And I also would like to thank all of you for staying with us and being willing to think about this issue of public history, because the Kutsche office is an institution of public history. A lot of you are involved in public history. You know, how will historical knowledge be used by the community? How will the community itself be involved in revealing that knowledge? And I think that I think one of the things this panel really offered is for us to think about different methods that could take place within public history for transmitting knowledge, you know, and Kaya talked a lot about this, you know, large field of Tecumseh corn, which it does not exist. But I think to me, and thinking about Indigenous perspectives, it should be evident, I hope for everybody, that if it did exist, it would be a public history project. As much as this, in this very traditional space, is a public history project. Do I have some big plan for how to get from here to there? I do not. But I think we should be considering not just how we can learn about other people's, but how different ways of constructing knowledge can influence the things that we accept as history. So I want to thank you for letting me talk a little bit about that, and I'd love to talk with you more about it during the break, if anybody'd like to join us. We have some snacks still, I think, and we'll reconvene here at, let's see here, 3:15-ish for the next panel. Thank you so much.